Welcome to the 16th episode of the Undisciplined podcast. I am your host, as always, Dr. Nico Beitendach. It's been a while since I've had an episode, so I'm glad to finally get one out again. I've been quite busy, and as I think those of you who've been here for a while can deduce, this podcast is a pet project of mine. It means I can't bring you content every week like many podcasts do. The point is that I only do this when there's someone I really want to talk to and who I think is worth having on. I'm not making episodes for the sake of it, and I hope it shows. I've also been quite busy with my own projects. The biggest one is my first monograph that will come out in January. And I'm also developing some new, hopefully exciting directions that Undisciplined can go into. It's not quite at the point yet where I want to make public exactly what it will look like, but suffice it to say that I am working on some new ideas, and I will share that with you soon. And hopefully it's something that you will enjoy and take some value from. Anyway, today I'm talking to Dr. Christian Morgner from Sheffield University, in particular about a book that he translated and edited. It's a collection of essays or articles by Niklas Luhmann, and he compiled them into the volume entitled The Making of Meaning: From the Individual to Social Order. These are all taken from Luhmann's series called Semantics and Social Structure, and the essays that Dr. Morgner included in here are all extremely interesting and I think relevant to our contemporary situation. The book came out earlier this year with Oxford University Press, and I talk with Dr. Morgner more about how he translated and the content of the various essays. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for sticking with Undisciplined, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Okay, Christian, thank you very much for talking to me today. I'm very honored to have you here. You just very recently published a book, The Making of Meaning, which contains some of your own work as well as a lot of translations from Niklas Luhmann. So before we delve straight into the book, it's my tradition to ask guests first to introduce themselves a little bit, especially their academic background. And maybe also what would be interesting to hear is how you became interested in Luhmann in particular.
Thank you, Nico. Thanks so much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. So by training, I'm a sociologist. I've studied sociology in my undergraduate and master's levels, and actually came across Luhmann at quite an early stage in my undergraduate studies. I think it was in the first semester of my second year, and like it's typical introductory seminar on contemporary sociological theory, I think it was. And I was actually meant to give a presentation on Luhmann. I had no idea who Niklas Luhmann was at the time. So really, at the time, somehow by accident, that I stumbled across this work. But I think what is supposedly quite interesting is that the text I had to present or talk about is also the very text that forms the core of the book that I've published now 20 years later. So it's coming all in full circle. So in a sense, I discovered Luhmann quite early in my sociological studies and was quite intrigued, by the complexity of his sociological approach. But then I think my studies at the time were all around quite theoretical and quite conceptual. So in that sense, it wasn't just Luhmann. I was also reading quite a number of other sociological thinkers at the time: Noel Elias, Jürgen Habermas, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and so forth. So there was really a very strong sociological grounding in terms of reading also these thinkers in terms of their original publications and their original texts, so not just through textbooks. And I found that quite intriguing because it really challenged your everyday understanding of the social world and how we interact with others and so forth. So I think that was quite intriguing, and therefore I kind of follow that thinking, because it seems to offer something where you can think out of the box, beyond your typical perceptions of the social world. And I think it stayed with me that I always wanted not just to become some sort of armchair social theorist that is just rereading existing literature, but I always had a very strong interest in combining it with empirical research, either empirical research being at the very beginning and stimulating conceptual thinking, or having certain conceptual ideas and then seeing how they can be explored empirically. So, for instance, in my master's dissertation at the time, I wrote on wrote a text on trust, and I was quite interested in particular in the role of trust in the transformation of Eastern Germany at the time, and the role of the church as a kind of institution that offered a lot of trust within the political system that was largely being detrusted, and therefore for instance providing a place of congregation where people could meet quite safely and discuss, in a sense, the political state and political fates of Eastern Germany. I collected a lot of empirical data at the time and so forth, and I found it really intriguing, and kind of then developed this further. So also, for instance, in my PhD, I worked on global media events, which in a sense combined an interest in network research on media messages, but likewise also looked into the production of meaning making. Right, so these networks of media messages and how they're interlinked, and how meaning is being mediated and transferred from one message to the other within a really short time frame, but also at the global scale. And I remember, for the research, I traveled to archives in the US, I traveled to archives in Singapore and in Germany and so forth, in order to also provide and develop the kind of empirical evidence and data, so that the theory is not just a mere illustration of the data and vice versa, but really that they speak to each other quite at eye level, and that the data is really challenging the theory, and the theory can also grow because it's been challenged by something it's been tested with. And so, in a sense, because having worked across these topics and with the variety of different methods and conceptual ideas, I was always quite flexible in terms of my own academic biography. So I've then worked later on in history departments, language departments, so more in the humanities, but then also worked at sociology departments, communication departments, and currently I'm a senior lecturer, or like an associate professor if you use the US system, in a management school. So in a sense of thinking quite globally, and looking at these subjects from such an interdisciplinary perspective has enabled me to work across a variety of different academic disciplines, because I think the notion of meaning is something that is quite important for all of these disciplines. I don't know, be it in history, for instance, how we narrate history, so how we construct historical narratives and so forth. Meaning is very important. You work in the language department, obviously, so the semantics and translations and meanings are very, very important. But likewise, so in a communication, or even in a management school, right? So the way we think about innovation, new meanings, come to the world, meanings being transformed within organizational contexts, the whole tradition around sense making. So that's something as a kind of trajectory that I've tried to develop further, and in a sense has informed the work on the book project that you've mentioned.
Thank you. This centrality of meaning in your research connects very nicely with this book. And speaking about that now, there's always been a kind of a steady stream of translations from the German to the English of Luhmann's work, and of course also other languages too. But I get the impression from your volume that you chose the texts to include into the translation very carefully, and that these texts all hang together under a certain theme with a clear goal in mind. And I think that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like that you are trying to present a side of Luhmann that perhaps German scholars already knew, but that is unfamiliar to English scholars on Luhmann, those who don't have the ability to go back to the German texts. Am I right with this? What was the central theme of the selections that you made, and what were you trying to show in all these other translations that are happening? What were you trying to put forward to at least the English academic community?
Yeah, I think. Thank you, Nico. I think there are two elements that, two ideas that really inform the selection of the text in that book, but then also that book project overall. So one of these elements is when we look at the presentation of Luhmann's work, I think in 99% of the different academic contexts, be it sociology, be it management and education, and wherever he's received, it's typically seen as system theory. All right, so that keyword system is being used pretty much all the time, and I also felt a little bit unease with that presentation, because we're looking here at the scholar with a work of a time span over 40 years, having published so and so many publications, and it all seems to be reduced to this one label, to this one term. And I think that seemed maybe something useful for the purpose of an introductory handbook into sociology. But then it comes at the danger that you start to neglect the complexity and all the other areas and all the other ideas that a particular scholar has to offer. So in a sense, it's not just something that applies necessarily to Luhmann, that kind of tendency to use these sort of labels, right? You see it with others, Parsons as being a functionalist, or Marxism and so forth. And then immediately certain concepts and ideas pop into our minds for the reason that others remain in the shadows. And so in that sense I felt it's a bit of a problematic reading, because just seeing Luhmann as a system theorist ignores certain parts of his work, of his thinking, where he actually didn't use the word system, right? And where he even himself was sometimes a bit at unease when he spoke at a certain conference or gave a paper. He didn't use the word system in that presentation at all, and was still being introduced as a system theorist. So it also kind of raised eyebrows on his side, and some of his students reported that he even turned it into a bit of a joking exercise, that he wouldn't write papers or would do presentations without the word system in at all, and still being presented as such. So I think there is, on the one hand, something that informed this book project, what is to a certain extent a criticism of that sociological approach to how we present great thinkers, and using sometimes overtly narrow labels, and thereby ignoring certain other traditions. And the role of meaning is one of these concepts that is actually really, really central for Luhmann, and becomes therefore easily ignored. And just to give an example, in the early debate that he had with Jürgen Habermas in 1971, where these two great scholars met and discussed their different theoretical approaches, which later became published as a book. Luhmann wrote a text in there which is called "Meaning as a Basic Concept." So he didn't publish actually a text in there which is called "System as a Basic Concept." He never published actually such a text, where he put that centrality to the term system. So we can see already there are other concepts where he thought they're really actually quite central for my thinking. So how ideas with a variety of different problems, but they are, let's say, neglected if you just view a scholar under a particular label. The other element is also that obviously the term or the word system, and I think this is potentially something that applies more so to the Anglo-American context, has quite a negative connotation. So systems are being seen as something quite static, as something machine-like, and so forth, that seem to be against freedom, against human creativity, and so forth. Right. So in particular, with the in the aftermath of, I don't know, Talcott Parsons' work and his work falling out of favor, that not only applied to this particular scholar, but it seemed to me also applied to the term systems overall, right? So, and therefore, as soon as people might hear, the word system, they think of it in a kind of, negative terms, and then also, maybe ignore the work of a particular scholar if they think it's being associated with this. So I think, so, it's kind of, therefore, trying being critical of these readings, of these traditions, of these presentations, which neglects of, really, really important parts of, of a particular thinker. And like I said, so, meaning being one of them. The other elements of, like I said, so, there are two elements that inform this book. The other one, the second one, is what we also have this tendency when we think of a social theorist, right? We immediately sort of, imagine potentially someone who is kind of like an armchair philosopher, who isn't sort of, really engaging with the world. They're sitting at home, I don't know, looking at the sky, looking at the stars, if thinking about the world, just reading books and so forth. And I think, collecting these works, I was also quite intentional in a sense to deal with this particular reading, because Luhmann was actually, one of those social theorists who was also extremely empirical. I mean, so in his work, he was involved in a large quantitative survey that he conducted on reforms of public administration in Germany, which was published as a book, and several journal papers came out of it. So it's like, quantitative skills were also at his disposal. For the book on love, he spent several months in archives in Paris. Reading all that archival materials, a project, similar to the works of Norbert Elias or Michel Foucault in terms of his skill set. And he was also, very much an ethnographer, traveling the world and, trying to see things for, his own eyes and really, experiencing these matters. And I think, that book project is then also meant to kind of, showcase more his empirical thinking, right? So, to see actually how skillful he was when he dealt with all that historical material, right? His really his skill in a sense at reading all these old documents, interpreting, ordering them, analyzing them, and so forth, and not just glossing over by using like a certain number of theoretical concepts. So you can really see also that the sociologist, Luhmanns, is coming through in these texts, by being able, to deal with all this empirical data. And I think, these two developments, focusing on the aspect of meaning, as another really central aspect, and something I think which will also really be, could be well connected to the Anglophone context, but then likewise also that more empirical thinking is potentially something that could build bridges, into his work and make others more interested in actually reading it.
It's funny that you mention this connection, that how a single term can get connected to a thinker, because I'm right now busy reading again in the field of legal theory. I'm reading Hans Kelsen's famous A Pure Theory of Law. And, for even an undergraduate law student, Kelsen is equal to the idea of the Grundnorm. And when you read A Pure Theory of Law, the term doesn't come up that much at all, actually. I think he has, it's definitely there and part of it, but I don't even think it's the central idea that he has when I read A Pure Theory of Law. So immediately, because I'm reading that stuff like this week every day, so that idea has come up too, with this idea of systems and Luhmann and Kelsen and the Grundnorm. But anyway, so you talk about meaning, and then you also mention Luhmann's command of historical material. And what these essays show is his mode of thinking being actually a very historical one. Almost, another name you mentioned now is Foucault, almost in this Foucauldian way, this very historical lens through which he looks at in his own work. So I think this idea of meaning on the one hand and this historical approach on the other hand has very direct implications for how we understand knowledge and knowledge creation. But why do you think they are especially relevant right now?
I think they're I think they're really important or relevant right now, simply because when I think we would have to go back a bit in history in order to understand why they're so relevant at the moment. And I think we are now at the point in time, I think, where some of the greatest of sociological projects that were concerned what you might call a theory of society have to a certain extent largely disappeared from the field of sociology. So, and I think when you, for instance, when you go back a bit in time and you look at the development of sociology in particular after World War II, it was a time of great expansion of sociology. So it was a time of great expansion in terms of, all these new subfields of sociology emerged, media sociology, educational sociology, political sociology. So none of that really sort of, existed in, the times of, when sociology was founded as a discipline, where people were more concerned with what is the object of sociology, what makes sociology as a discipline, what are its methods, what are its institutions, what are its journals, and so forth. What does, training look like? But now I think after World War II, sociology starts to react in a sense upon its own, right? So it has already, built a certain standing. And now the question is, it kind of, starts to look at what it has, Tucker Parsons being someone who tries to fuse and merge, existing sociological thinkers. But likewise, therefore, you also see that now these kind of, sub-disciplines emerge and really greatly expand the field of sociology. And so, while they're expanding, actually, it's also, so, that particular period where the kind of, niche sort of, emerge, where people can engage with sociology from this really abstract and perspective, while they want to formulate a sociological theory, so that can unite all these different subdisciplines. And that's not necessarily something that only happens in Germany at the time. So Luhmann starts broadly with this in the 1950s and 1960s, and you see that tendency also in the work of Jürgen Habermas. But likewise, you see similar sort of, scholars in terms of age and academic career in other countries. I don't know, Pierre Bourdieu, right, who also published his main works in the 1980s, like Luhmann, like Habermas. In the UK, you have Anthony Giddens, similar academic biography, also published his main theoretical work in the 1980s, or let's say, I don't know, in the US, James Coleman also published his main theoretical work on rational choice in the same period. All right, so it's quite interesting stuff, historically, when you look at that, they also, started to work on that in that field of great expansion, because there was a niche, in a sense, for that kind of academic thinking. It was also seen that there's a need, for uniting these different disciplines and subjects. And therefore, I think you see that, most of their publications fall more or less within the same time frame. But then, after the 1980s, once they have published, all these works, that kind of development, let's say, starts to stagger a little bit, or let's say, there isn't such a great interest anymore in these, very encompassing and grand social projects. I mean, you still obviously you have sociological theory, but that particular type of theory of society isn't really a core project anymore. It kind of it's still there, and we're kind of rereading these traditions and sometimes rediscovering them. But there isn't really anyone who seriously pursues a similar project at that grand scale. So, and what does it obviously then mean for our situation today, right? So what we kind of starting now on a more social side, and let's say outside of academia, maybe more in public discourse and society itself, to realize its own complexity, right? All the challenges that we have, be it in terms of ecological challenges, in terms of still internal conflicts that can happen in the world, large scale social inequalities that we see, and so forth. So really challenging situation that is being discovered. And the question is, how can we make sense of this? How can we give meaning to all these different very complex developments? And I think this is what I fear, that suddenly that in particular that meaning becomes really, really interesting, because suddenly society finds itself in that situation where it's trying to grasp for that meaning, where it's kind of trying to make sense of itself, but it doesn't have these great projects anymore on which it can rely on, right? So therefore it's kind of now opening up various possibilities, and there's a great search for potential solutions and alternative ideas that can provide an explanation, that can potentially provide a new type of framework or new mode of thinking that is quite up for these complex changes that we're discovering in the 21st century. And I think this is why the notion of meaning, I thought, is so really interesting and potentially quite fitting for the situation of society that we're experiencing at the moment.
This reminds me of, this is already a few months ago, but I think it was this year. The English newspaper The Guardian had a column, and I forgot who wrote it, but the writer was complaining that, or one of the problems of society today is that, in his or her words, was that we had lost a shared sense of reality. And I thought, okay, that's true, but Luhmann already knew this decades ago. That this is not news.
But I think it's kind of going in a direction, trying the point that I was making, that let's say certain forms of descriptions of society as being a great collective, or something that we share with all people around the world, or like this notion of sharedness or collectiveness, or I don't know, we agree with everybody, or it's being negotiated and so forth. So I mean, there are severe cracks, right, in those descriptions, and they don't really seem to work anymore. Be it because of we kind of start to realize the global size of society, be it due to the influx of communication technologies. So I think there's certain developments, definitely within society itself, that kind of showcase there's a huge disparity between these traditional forms of how we describe and understand societies and how this society presents itself. And I think in that gap, right? Some of these conceptions now become to the forefront, right? The role of meaning, and you could say, I mean, if from the perspective of these kind of traditional scholars, how can you make meaning in a world where you actually don't have to agree with anybody? Where these kind of shared norms and values and cultures don't seem to exist. I mean, obviously, we're seeing it's not falling apart, right? It's society is still operating in whatever way. So somewhat there are certain structures, mechanisms, operations in place, right, that enable that form of meaning making. And the question is, what are these? How do they work? How do they deal with that enormous complexity that we start to discover, like with the global society and all these processes, right? And I think this is some of the key questions. I found that book can make a contribution to.
I want to shift direction, but only very slightly. While we're talking about kind of myths about Luhmann that are being challenged also in your work, one of these typical myths that you hear is that Luhmann, either you hear two versions. You hear the one version that Luhmann was politically conservative, and the other version that you hear is that actually his own political opinions are kind of hidden from his academic work or not present, right? I personally think, after reading the articles that you collected, that I think there is something of Luhmann's own politics that can be gleaned here. Maybe not that explicitly, but also not, it's not completely absent either. Would you agree with this assessment of mine? And what do you think more broadly are the political implications of these particular articles and reading them together the way that you arrange them?
I think, Nikos, the answer to this depends a little bit on what we mean by the term political. And I suppose there can be two readings of this, or two answers to this. Let's say if we understand political as a more generalist term, as let's say having a particular agenda, right, having a particular preference in terms of that you would like to change the status quo, then I think it seems to me really, really obvious that this is very much at the core of Luhmann's project. I mean, like, it was called the sociological enlightenment, and he published more than 50 books and 300 articles, and I can hardly imagine he wouldn't have done that if he had no interest in making a difference. So I think even if that kind of writing is evidence of having an interest in making a difference, but from the perspective of this more general understanding, I think one of the key interest was initially to make a difference to the field of sociology. All right, so if you know the way sociology tries to conceptualize society in terms of the kind of empirical methods it's developing for its research and so forth. Really, so if you know, I think this is if you know where you see actually a very, very strong agenda, and where he was always extremely critical and very outspoken in his publication, where he was also at times quite confrontational. Think about his texts on political steering, right? Where the political scientists would say, there isn't enough power in society, with the state. And Luhmann said then the quite opposite, or we need more power, right, to make decisions, or others. When you read about his texts on memories, then there was a kind of a tradition at the time coming more from archaeology and literary studies saying, there is, we need, to memorize the past and memorize more. And then, Luhmann put an emphasis on forgetting as a key function for actually that, memorizing can take place at all. So you see stuff, there's definitely also quite a critical style in his writing when it comes to a variety of different academic traditions, and wanting to move them forward, wanting them to progress, and having the right tools and the right concepts at hand in order to have a better grasp of the developments that occurring in modern society and society itself. So I think that's definitely one of his intentions, which I think is quite clear throughout. If you have a more narrow understanding of the term political, political as in the sense of the state or the nation state, then I think so. Luhmann wasn't someone who was always there in a sense, who was quite outspoken. I don't know, saying something about certain political reforms. But you can see at certain times and on certain occasions when it came to certain developments, he could be quite direct, when it comes to reform of public administration and so forth. So I mean, there were definitely things that that mattered, and was why he mentioned criticism and provided solutions. But then, on the other hand, I felt he didn't make this always extremely clear or mention it, simply because I think there was a large agreement in terms of why he thought things would have to change, even in allegiance with Jürgen Habermas. So often I think the differences between the two are quite overplayed. And when it comes to reforming education, or when it came to making certain changes to politics and so forth, I think largely the two of them would have agreed. So it was more in terms of the theoretical concepts that would underpin their thinking. This is where you would see differences. But I think they kind of shared a lot in terms of their narrow understanding in terms of political reforms. And so you might then go to the third question. So what are the political implications of these texts? Well, some of the political implications is definitely we kind of start to see how some of these concepts that we seem to taken so much for granted nowadays actually have a very recent historical development. So, for instance, we look at the term individual in there. It seems really strange to us nowadays to think how it could be any different, right? How could there be people in the world that wouldn't describe themselves in terms of willpower, in terms of determining their own fate, like having to build their own identities, trying to figure out who they are. So all the challenges that we find. Who are we? So what do we do? What's our place in the world? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? I don't know, the educational demands that we have nowadays to grow and to educate ourselves further. I mean, all that is broadly about 200 years old. Right, so for the kind of 6,000 years of human history, that wasn't something that societies were really concerned with. Individuality and developing yourself out of yourself. It must have been really strange, to people back then, if you would have asked them about their feelings and how do you feel and what does it mean to you and their inner being. So probably people would have probably afraid and run away. So if you had asked them these questions, so I think you see there. I think Luhmann really comes to the forefront. And you could then, even go a step further and then ask yourself, well, if these concepts have emerged in the past 200 years, what has been their impact, right? In terms of advantages and disadvantages, what has been the impact if we start to understand ourselves as individuals? Think about like mental health problems that experience nowadays. So on the one hand, it seems very beautiful, so to think, I've got all that freedom at my hand and, figuring out who I am and so forth. But then, more and more within the last, 10 or 15 years, we're also starting to see the side effects of all of that it's not that easy, right? It can be very challenging. And there's a lot of, mental health problems that we're now starting to discover because, they used to be under that kind of, stigma, but they're definitely sort of, side effects of a concept that doesn't provide you stability from birth on, because you really sort of, have to figure it out along the way. And yeah, unfortunately, sort of, within, technology studies, you've got all these institutions that try to figure out what is the impact of a certain technology, what are the dangers of nuclear energy? But you could ask yourself the same questions. What are the dangers of an invention of the individual, right? What are the dangers of the invention of the nation state and so forth? So, and these are all really recent concepts. And I think this is something where you can learn a lot, I think, from Luhmann saying that something that has been taken for granted and seems to be so noble is something rather quite recent. And we haven't really understood, the social consequences of operating and using these concepts, simply because I don't think so, we're aware of their recent historical development, because they seem to be as if they had been there for all humanity.
Yeah, that's interesting. My own doctoral work was pretty much on the idea of this very recent coming into being of the nation state, and do we really understand it, and what are the impacts of that? But anyway, so you bring us nicely into my next question, which, talking about the individual, and you're even talking about the mental anguish that individuality has given us. You break with a small tradition in this book where, in previous English translations of Luhmann, not the social systems but the psychic systems have always been translated in English as psychic systems, and in your book you break with this tradition by changing psychic systems to psychical systems.
Mm-hmm.
So for those that did not or have not yet read your introduction, do you mind explaining why you thought psychic systems was unsatisfactory, and why you chose to break away with psychical systems?
It's interesting that when you look at the term, that broadly describes mental activities, let's say, is a term that is also changing in Luhmann's works over time. So it isn't so, that he is using the same term for this across all his writings. So initially, let's say, I think we're talking here about the period of the 1960s and 1970s. He calls them person systems. So I think, so, very much still, coming from a action-based conception of society, but you kind of already start to sense that person systems and social systems are different, right? So that is the kind of initial language that he's using. He's not using, unlike I think Talcott Parsons, who's using the word personality systems, which has kind of like a closer psychological connection. He's using the term person system, because it seems for Luhmann more, closer in a sense related to that as a social address, someone who's being constructed like at the person at the other end. So I think this is something that very much informs this kind of early thinking. But then when he started to introduce ideas more around self-referential systems, this kind of, it seems sort of that what is necessary now is to identify how do these systems, in a sense, how do these two different types of systems, what kind of elements produce them, right? So with the person system or with the social system, they were both sort of constituted in a sense by the same element, which were actions or meaningful actions, so to say. But once of the notion of the self-referential moves more to the forefront, it becomes kind of, clearer to him that conceptually you need to, better able to identify what elements constitute them. So, what constitutes them as a system. So, what is their mode of meaning making, so to say, right? And most of, that focus on, what is their different mode of meaning making, then two other notions, in a sense, are a bit more pushed to the forefront. So, which is on the one hand the term communication, which becomes the kind of key defining term for the social system, and then in terms of the mental activities, Luhmann is using kind of psychological systems, as you could say. So, he's trying to describe here the psychological processes and so forth. But I think my impression was he was never extremely happy with that term at the time, because later on in his writings, he is then using the term consciousness systems, because to a certain extent, the problem is that with the consciousness system, it includes all operations that are conscious, right? So whatever sort of, is the system is unable to observe in that time, so isn't part of these operations. And to a certain extent, that's something that is still sort of, problematic with this kind of, medium stage, where he referred more to these kind of, psychological terms. So I think, so, this is just a bit to give a bit of a background in terms of, where these different terms and traditions come from. Unfortunately, so, when we look at the variety of translations, it is always translated with the term psychic systems. Yeah, so, that kind of, medium stage. And as you know, the term psychic has actually quite different meaning within English. So, referring more to, the sixth sense, and so, actually, so, processes that don't really seem to exist in the real world. So, therefore, almost gives like a very different understanding of this one. So it was always, quite problematic, and in a sense, not really reflecting the original meaning of the term that Luhmann had in mind. So while we were working at the translation, and trying to, in a sense, being able to correct some of the readings of Luhmann, we also had the ability to correct, some of the mistranslations in terms of, some of the terms that we used at. And so, while doing that, I tried, to look into different terms that seemed more appropriate. And it's actually quite interesting when you look at the history of the word psychical, that in kind of, the early days when this word became into use, so more like the late 19th century or early 20th century, it didn't yet have these connotations as it has today, in a sense of referring to certain unexplicable phenomena. But at that time, the term simply meant it's processes that refer to or like referring to mental processes, right? Referring to the kind of psychological world. And I thought, this is actually quite an apt description of what Luhmann had in mind at the time. So when he conceptualized this particular term in the 1980s. And so therefore, I felt as actually an opportunity here to correct some of these translations and refer within English to the kind of earlier meanings of that term, and make it clearer to the reader. We are not referring to systems that can sense something, I don't know, in the other world, right? But really referring to just certain types of mental activities that we typically understand with the meaning-making capacities of human beings.
I hope that subsequent translations by other people also follow this route.
Interestingly, there is a book, I think it's called The Differentiation of Society, and it's a book where Luhmann was also involved in the translation. They already also used that translation. So it was really, I think, the term was introduced with the translation of social systems, and then became, in a sense, the defining term. But like I said, in The Differentiation of Society, which is a book from 1982, if I'm not mistaken, and Luhmann was actually involved in the translation, and even translated certain parts of the book. They already also used the term psychical in there.
My final question, and looking forward a little bit, is that I was fortunate enough to hear you talk at an event a few months ago by the British Sociology Association, and someone asked you about the future of Luhmann's work in the academia, if you see it staying the same or becoming more popular or declining. And I remember your answer as saying that we're probably, perhaps interest in Luhmann is on the decline. And should we, as someone like me or you who is obviously interested in his work, should we just accept that as kind of the natural circle of life of a thinker, and shrug our shoulders? Or should we work and insist on his importance and hope that others see things the way that we do? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think, when it comes to the reception of scholarly work, there are a variety of different trends that kind of take place. So there is, let's say, what you might call the more general trend of the academic field, and I've referred to some of that early on. That phase of great expansion after World War II, and where it was really easily possible to engage with such questions, right? So I think that is quite a long-term process when you look at the institutional development of the field. And like I mentioned, from the institutional development of that field, we're not only seeing, let's say, a decline in that kind of work in terms of Luhmann, but we're also seeing that quite across. I mean, there isn't really like a second Habermas. There isn't really like a second Pierre Bourdieu and so forth, right? So that kind of tradition that had its height in the 1980s and let's say early 1990s hasn't yet come to similar developments, and I think that's partially due to changes within the academic system overall. But then clearly you also have these kind of fashion trends that for certain periods a certain kind of sociology can be very, very popular, and often that's not really driven necessarily by the work of that particular scholar, but often it's driven by particular contextual developments in society itself. So for instance, again, if you're using the work of Jürgen Habermas as an example, I mean, two of his key readings, the transformation of the public sphere and the theory of communicative action, they really became only extremely influential at the end of the 1990s. Leading to his standing as a global scholar, and I mean, partially that was triggered by the invention of the internet. The kind of suddenly that society would experience it as a kind of global society. The breakdown of the world into different kinds of blocks, the Western and the Eastern bloc and so forth. And also, these developments, let's say, the internet and the kind of political changes that happened at that time, I think seemed to inspire some sort of hope that, through these communication technologies and the lack of, these superpowers, that, let's say a more bottom-up approach of, society, sharing and negotiating with itself would become possible. And during that time you see that these concepts of communicative action and the public sphere and negotiation became extremely popular, and had a real-term impact, and so forth. So then suddenly you see an enormous rise in citations of these books. So these are some of the kind of fashion trends, and then likewise, what you then also see is you see rediscoveries of certain scholars that then can happen. We see, for instance, the rediscovery of the work of Du Bois, an Afro-American scholar who was largely unknown for a very long period, being rediscovered and suddenly becoming a very vocal speaker that can contribute to the debates we're seeing at the moment around racism, institutional racism, and so forth. So again, these rediscoveries can happen in the light of these developments. But then I suppose what you also see is that patterns of receptions can actually also be quite uneven in global society itself. And I think, this is what you see also with the publication of this book, that Luhmann isn't necessarily well known in the Anglophone world, but for instance, he is very well known in the Spanish-speaking world, right? In particular, in Hispanic America, most of his books have been translated, and I think most of the sociologists in Hispanic America will know his name, right? You know, you travel to, I don't know, Chile or, you know, Mexico, and people will have heard of Luhmann. You know, they're familiar sort of, you know, with concepts like, you know, functional differentiation and autopoiesis and so forth. And so, you know, similarly, you will see that also he was for a certain period quite popular in the Scandinavian countries. So again, so, you know, you therefore also have these kind of, you know, regional variations. And then, you know, you might have sort of, you know, scholars like ourselves, you know, who are in that kind of, you know, niche and sort of, you know, seeing, you know, the relevance of his work for our empirical research, and therefore sort of, you know, can potentially contribute to a variety of different disciplines, be it, you know, in legal studies, be it in sociology, be it in management and so forth. So, you know, and therefore, you know, contributing, you know, to the development of his work, maybe not necessarily in sociology, but maybe sort of in all these other disciplines, and that's potentially also quite a positive development.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. And I know it sounds terrible that you've just released a book, but is there anything else that we can look forward to from you for?
So I think in terms of translations, you know, like book-wise translations or, you know, book-length work, I think so, and taking a bit of a break. But then there is this special issue with the journal Educational Theory coming out, which will include a translation of Luhmann's work on the child, or it's called, you know, The Child, a text that he published in the 1990s, where he also introduced actually a really interesting sociological concept on medium and form, and like a number of scholars who will kind of, you know, react or reply to this particular paper. And yes, if, you know, we're kind of finalizing, you know, the papers actually right at the moment. So hopefully, so, you know, that's something that should be published early next year.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. I would love to see that. So, Christian, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nico. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.